The small suburban neighborhood of Pine Creek was known for its quiet streets and friendly residents. Most of the houses were modest single-story homes with well-kept lawns, and everyone seemed to know each other by name. It was the kind of place where neighbors borrowed cups of sugar and watched out for suspicious activity. Among these homes stood a light blue house at the end of Oakwood Drive. It belonged to retired Army Sergeant Frank Wilson, a man in his early 50s who mostly kept to himself. Unlike his neighbors who hosted barbecues and block parties, Frank preferred the company of his two dogs and occasionally chatted with the elderly couple next door. Most people in the neighborhood knew he had served overseas for many years, but few knew the details of his military career. What they did know was that Frank was reliable, always helping clear snow from driveways in winter, and offering his toolbox when something needed fixing. He had moved to Pine Creek 3 years ago, and while not unfriendly, there was a certain distance he maintained. The neighbors respected this, understanding that some veterans preferred their space. On this particular Thursday morning, Frank loaded a small cooler and fishing gear into his faded red pickup truck. The early June sun was just beginning to warm the day as he double-checked his supplies. He planned to spend the weekend at Lake Mitchell, about 2 hours north. The fishing season had just opened, and he had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. "Morning, Frank. Heading out for that fishing trip?" called Mrs. Henderson, who was watering her flower beds next door. Frank nodded with a slight smile. "Yes, ma'am. The base should be biting this weekend. Well, have a good time. Don't worry about a thing here. Bill and I will keep an eye on your place," she offered, as she always did when he went away. "I appreciate that. But honestly, the house will be fine," Frank replied, his eyes briefly glancing back at his home. "Got my security system in place." Mrs. Henderson assumed he meant an alarm, not knowing that Frank's security system consisted of 2 highly trained former military working dogs that had served alongside him in Afghanistan. Most people in the neighborhood knew Frank had dogs but had rarely seen them up close. Frank preferred to walk them early in the morning or late in the evening when few people were around. What almost nobody knew was that these weren't ordinary pets. Shadow, a Belgian Malinois, and Rex, a German Shepherd, had both been trained by the military to detect explosives and apprehend threats. When Frank retired, he had adopted them after their service ended due to minor injuries that didn't affect their abilities, but made them unsuitable for continued military deployment. Frank opened the driver's side door and took one last look at his house. Through the front window, he could see Shadow sitting attentively watching him. Rex was likely patrolling elsewhere in the house, as was his habit. Frank gave a small hand signal that would be invisible to anyone else watching. Shadow's ears perked up in acknowledgement. "See you Sunday evening," Frank called to Mrs. Henderson before climbing into his truck and driving away. From across the street, behind the tinted windows of a parked sedan, 2 men watched the exchange with interest. They had been observing Frank's house for nearly a week, noting his routines and the schedules of the surrounding neighbors. "There he goes," said the taller man, who went by the nickname Hawk. He was thin but wiry, with darting eyes that constantly surveyed his surroundings, just like the past 3 Thursdays, right on schedule. His partner, a stockier man known as Bear, nodded. "But this time with fishing gear and a cooler. Looks like he'll be gone for the weekend." They had chosen Frank's house after careful consideration. They weren't reckless thieves who broke into homes randomly. They planned, observed, and selected targets that promised minimal risk and maximum reward. Frank's house had caught their attention because, despite its modest appearance, they had noticed some telling signs of valuable possessions. Last month, they had posed as lawn care specialists offering free quotes in the neighborhood. When Frank briefly opened his door to decline their services, Hawk had glimpsed a high-end sound system and what looked like expensive military memorabilia on the walls. Additionally, Bear had spotted Frank using what appeared to be the latest smartphone model and wearing a watch that seemed too expensive for someone living in such a modest home. Military guys often collect valuable stuff, Bear had reasoned. Rare weapons, medals, maybe even gold coins from overseas deployments. Plus, they're usually organized and careful with their money. Bet he keeps cash around. They had been waiting for the right opportunity, and this fishing trip seemed perfect. The neighborhood was quiet during weekdays, with most residents at work, and the elderly couple next door posed little threat. Still, they would wait until nightfall to make their move. "Did you see any sign of an alarm system?" Bear asked, pulling out a small notebook where he had been jotting observations. Hawk shook his head. No stickers on the windows, no obvious cameras. Might have something basic inside, but nothing serious. What about pets? Any barking when we went door to door? Never heard a thing, Bear confirmed, flipping through his notes. Neighbors mentioned he has dogs, but they must be pretty quiet. Probably takes them with him when he travels. This was their first significant mistake. Frank never took Shadow and Rex with him on fishing trips. The dogs were happier at home, where they had space to move and a familiar environment to patrol. Frank had installed a specialized doggy door at the back of the house that allowed them access to the fenced backyard, and he had trained them to maintain their routines even in his absence. The second mistake was missing the small, weathered sign partially hidden by overgrown bushes near the side of the house. It read "Property protected by military K9, with a silhouette of a dog in alert stance. The sign had faded over time and the bushes had grown around it, making it easy to overlook if you weren't specifically looking for it. As dusk approached, Hawk and Bear finalized their plan. They would park their car several blocks away and approach the house from the back, crossing through the yards of several empty homes that were currently for sale. They would enter through the back door, spend no more than 20 minutes inside, and focus on items that were easy to carry and sell: electronics, jewelry, cash, and perhaps some of those military collectibles they suspected Frank owned. "Remember, we're in and out," Hawk reminded his partner as they gathered their tools. "Lockpicks, gloves, small flashlights, and backpacks to carry their loot. 20 minutes max no matter what we find." Inside Frank's house, Shadow and Rex were already aware that something was different. Their training had made them exceptionally attuned to changes in their environment. They had noticed the unfamiliar car parked across the street and the men watching the house. While ordinary dogs might bark at strangers, these two had been trained to observe silently and respond only when necessary. As the sun set, the dogs settled into their evening routine. Frank had taught them to maintain normal patterns even when he was away. Rex patrolled the perimeter of the house, moving from room to room in a systematic way, while Shadow took up a position near the back door, where he could monitor both the kitchen and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The dogs had been trained to recognize different types of threats and respond accordingly. A friendly visitor who knocked on the door would be met with alert observation, but no aggression. An intruder attempting to enter uninvited would face a very different reception. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The neighborhood grew quiet as families finished dinner and settled in for the evening. Mrs. Henderson turned off her porch light at exactly 9:30 p.m., as she did every night. By 10:15, most of the houses on the street were dark except for the occasional blue glow of a television through drawn curtains. At 11:30, Hawk and Bear parked their sedan on a side street 3 blocks away and made their way through the backyards of the neighborhood. They moved carefully, avoiding motion sensor lights and staying close to fences and bushes for cover. When they reached Frank's backyard, they paused behind a large oak tree to observe the house. It was completely dark, with no signs of movement inside. "Looks clear," Hawk whispered, pulling on a pair of thin gloves. "Let's check the back door first. If it's too complicated, we can try a window." They approached the house silently, unaware that inside both Shadow and Rex were already on high alert. The dogs had heard the faint sounds of footsteps in the yard, sounds too light to be their owner's familiar tread. Rex had moved to a position near the front door, while Shadow remained stationed by the back entrance, both dogs completely still and silent, waiting. As Hawk and Bear reached the back porch, they were about to encounter a security system far more sophisticated and dangerous than any electronic alarm, and they had no idea what was waiting for them on the other side of that door. The back door of Frank's house had a deadbolt and a regular doorknob lock. Hawk examined both carefully with his small flashlight, keeping the beam shielded with his hand to minimize visible light. He was known among his circles as someone with a talent for locks, a skill he'd picked up during a brief stint working for a locksmith years ago. "Standard deadbolt," he whispered to Bear, who stood watch, scanning the neighboring yards for any sign of movement. "Shouldn't take more than a couple minutes." Hawk pulled out his lock-picking tools from a small leather case. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he inserted a tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole and a pick into the top. He could feel the pins inside the lock as he carefully manipulated them. Inside the house, Shadow remained perfectly still near the back door. The dog's acute hearing picked up the faint metallic sounds of the lock being worked. Years of training had taught the Belgian Malinois to recognize these specific noises. Shadow's muscles tensed slightly, but he made no sound. Through the darkness of the house, Rex had also heard the noise and silently moved closer to the back area, positioning himself in the dining room where he would be invisible to anyone entering, but would have a clear line of sight. The dogs communicated with subtle body language that would be imperceptible to humans. A slight tilt of Shadow's ears signaled to Rex that a threat was attempting entry at the back door. Rex's response was equally subtle, a barely perceptible shift in posture that acknowledged the message. They had worked together for years, first in war zones and now in this suburban home, and had developed an almost telepathic connection. Outside, Hawk felt the final pin set into place and the tension wrench turned slightly. "Got it," he muttered, moving onto the doorknob lock, which was significantly easier to pick. Within another minute, he felt the satisfying click of the second lock giving way. "We're in," he whispered to Bear, who gave a final glance around before turning his attention back to the door. "Remember, 20 minutes max," Bear reminded as Hawk slowly turned the doorknob, carefully applying pressure to minimize any sound. The door opened into a dark kitchen. The men paused, listening intently for any sounds that might indicate an alarm system had been triggered. After several seconds of silence, they stepped inside and gently closed the door behind them. Bear pulled out his flashlight, keeping the beam pointed downward to avoid the light being visible through windows. The kitchen was tidy and modestly furnished, with basic appliances and simple countertops. Nothing immediately valuable caught their attention. "Let's check the living room first, then the bedrooms," Hawk suggested, his voice barely audible. What they didn't realize was that Shadow had silently moved from his position near the door to behind the kitchen island, tracking their movements while remaining unseen. Rex had also repositioned himself, slipping from the dining room into the hallway that led to the bedrooms, effectively creating a net that the intruders would eventually walk into. The men moved through the kitchen into the living room, their flashlight beams scanning the space. Here they found more promising targets. A large flat-screen television hung on one wall, and beneath it sat the high-end sound system Hawk had glimpsed during their earlier reconnaissance. On another wall was a display case containing what appeared to be military medals, patches, and a few folded flags. "Jackpot," Bear whispered, approaching the display case. Some collectors would pay good money for authentic military memorabilia. Hawk moved toward the entertainment center, checking the television and sound system to determine how easily they could be removed. "This TV is mounted pretty securely. Might take too long to get it down," he said, "but the sound system components should come out easily." As they discussed their findings, neither man noticed Shadow, who had followed them into the living room and positioned himself in a dark corner, watching their every move. The dog's training had been extensive and specific. Observe first, gather intelligence on the threat, and wait for the right moment to act. Bear opened his backpack and began carefully removing items from the display case. Among them was a shadow box containing several medals, including what looked like a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. He placed these into his bag with surprising gentleness, almost respectful despite the crime he was committing. "Check for a safe," Hawk suggested, moving toward a small desk in the corner of the room. "Military guys often keep weapons or cash locked up." Bear nodded and directed his flashlight toward the hallway. "I'll check the master bedroom. That's usually where people keep safes." As Bear turned toward the hallway, his flashlight beam briefly swept across the floor and caught a pair of reflective eyes. He froze, the light jerking back to the spot, but now there was nothing there. Rex had already moved silently into one of the bedrooms. "Did you see that?" Bear whispered, his voice suddenly tense. "See what?" Hawk asked, pausing his search of the desk drawers. "I thought I saw eyes, like an animal or something." Hawk frowned. "Probably just a reflection off something. Check the bedroom." Bear hesitated, then nodded and moved toward the hallway again, his flashlight beam now moving more frantically as he checked corners and shadows. The confidence he had felt moments ago was beginning to waver. As he entered the hallway, Rex was waiting in the master bedroom, hidden just inside the doorway. The German shepherd could smell the intruder's nervousness, the subtle change in his scent as adrenaline began to flow. This was something the dogs had been trained to detect in hostile environments, where identifying fear and aggression could mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, in the living room, Hawk continued searching through the desk. He found some cash in one drawer, a few $100s, and some documents that looked like they might be important. As he pocketed the money and turned to check another part of the room, he suddenly had the distinct feeling he was being watched. The feeling was so strong that he turned around quickly, sweeping his flashlight across the room. The beam passed right over Shadow, who had shifted positions and was now partially hidden behind an armchair. The dog's training allowed him to remain perfectly still even as the light passed over him, and his dark coat blended with the shadows. Seeing nothing, Hawk tried to shake off the feeling and turned his attention to the entertainment center again. He began unplugging the sound system components, placing them carefully into his backpack. In the master bedroom, Bear was having similar unsettling feelings. The room was neat and Spartan, reflecting Frank's military background. The bed was made with tight hospital corners and there were few decorative items. A photograph on the nightstand showed a younger Frank in uniform with his unit, including 2 military working dogs that looked remarkably similar to the reflective eyes Bear thought he had seen. The photo made him pause. Dogs, he muttered to himself, suddenly making a connection. He remembered their notes. Neighbors had mentioned Frank had dogs, but they had never heard any barking. Just as this realization was dawning on him, Bear heard a low, almost imperceptible growl from behind the bedroom door. He spun around, his flashlight illuminating Rex, who now stood in plain view, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Bear's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary pet. The German Shepherd's stance was alert and threatening, its eyes intelligent and focused. Most frighteningly, the dog wasn't barking wildly as a normal dog might. It was controlled, deliberate and clearly trained. Hawk, Bear called out, his voice cracking as he slowly backed away from the dog. We've got a problem. In the living room, Hawk heard the fear in his partner's voice and stood up straight. What is it? Dogs, Bear replied, his voice tight with fear. Military dogs. As if on cue, Shadow emerged from his hiding spot in the living room, no longer concealing his presence. Hawk's flashlight beam found the Belgian Malinois standing between him and the kitchen, their planned escape route. The 2 men were now effectively trapped, with a highly trained military dog blocking each potential exit. The dogs made no move to attack, but their stance was clear. The intruders were not leaving. What do we do? Bear asked, still facing Rex in the bedroom doorway, afraid to move in any direction. Hawk's mind raced, trying to find a solution. He had dealt with guard dogs before, usually by bringing treats or using special sprays designed to mask his scent. But he had nothing like that now, and these weren't ordinary dogs. Their behavior was unlike anything he had encountered. Methodical, strategic, almost human in their intelligence. Maybe we can make a run for it, Hawk suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. On the count of 3, we both sprint for the back door. But as he took one tentative step toward the kitchen, Shadow let out a warning growl that stopped him in his tracks. The message was unmistakable. Any sudden movement would be met with immediate action. The thieves were now caught in a standoff with 2 highly trained military canines, and it was becoming increasingly clear who had the upper hand. What had seemed like an easy score was turning into the most dangerous situation of their criminal careers. And the night was still young. Frank wouldn't be back until Sunday evening. As realization dawned on the intruders that they were completely outmatched, a new level of fear began to set in. These weren't just guard dogs. They were tactical operators with 4 paws and sharp teeth, and they had just caught their targets in a perfectly executed trap. Time seemed to slow down in the tense standoff. Hawk stood frozen in the living room, his eyes locked with Shadow's unwavering gaze. The Belgian Malinois hadn't moved any closer, but maintained his position, blocking the path to the kitchen and back door. Can we call this off? Bear whispered from the hallway where he remained cornered by Rex. Maybe if we just put everything back and leave? Hawk's mind raced through their options, none of them good. They could try to fight the dogs, but everything about these animals screamed professional training. They weren't dealing with typical house pets, but military-grade guardians who likely had years of combat experience. I don't think these dogs are going to just let us walk out, Hawk replied, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. But they haven't attacked yet. Maybe they're just trained to contain threats until help arrives. Help? Bear's voice cracked. The owner's gone fishing for the weekend. There's no help coming. This realization hung heavy in the air. They were trapped in a standoff that could potentially last for days. The thought was almost worse than facing an immediate attack. Hawk slowly lowered himself into a sitting position on the floor, careful to make no sudden movements. I think our best bet is to stay calm. No quick movements, no threatening gestures. Bear followed his partner's lead, slowly sinking to the floor in the hallway. Rex watched him intently but made no move to approach. The German Shepherd's disciplined behavior was almost more unnerving than aggression would have been. Minutes ticked by in silence. The only sounds were the men's nervous breathing and the occasional shifting of weight. The dogs remained vigilant, their posture relaxed yet ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. What kind of training do military dogs get? Bear asked quietly, partly to break the unbearable silence and partly because understanding their captors seemed important now. Hawk had once watched a documentary about military working dogs. They're trained to detect explosives, patrol areas, track people, and apprehend threats, he explained. They can be taught to hold a person without injuring them seriously. Or, he didn't finish the sentence. These two seem like they've done this before, Bear observed, noticing how confidently the dogs had trapped them. Like they've caught people in real combat situations. He wasn't wrong. Shadow and Rex had both served multiple tours in Afghanistan, where they had helped apprehend enemy combatants and protected their handlers during countless missions. Frank had often told them they were the best partners he'd ever worked with, more reliable than many humans. As if reading their thoughts, Shadow made a small adjustment to his position, moving slightly to maintain a better angle on Hawk. The movement, though minimal, sent Hawk's heart racing again. Maybe we could use something as a distraction, Hawk suggested after nearly half an hour had passed. His legs were starting to cramp from sitting still for so long. Bear glanced around the hallway, looking for anything that might divert the dog's attention. Like what? We can't exactly order a pizza with extra bacon. Despite their dire situation, the comment almost made Hawk smile. I was thinking more like creating a loud noise in one direction while we run the other way. As they whispered about possible escape plans, Rex suddenly stood at attention, his ears perked forward. A moment later, Shadow also shifted his posture, head tilting slightly as if listening for something. What's happening? Bear asked, tensing up. Hawk shook his head, equally confused by the dog's change in behavior. Then he heard it too, the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Someone's here, he whispered, hope and dread mingling in his chest. Discovery would mean arrest, but at least this standoff would end. The sound of a car door closing was followed by footsteps on the front porch. Then came the jingling of keys and the front door opening. Hello? Frank? Called a woman's voice. It's just me checking on things like I promised. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor. She had mentioned to her husband that she hadn't seen any lights go on or off in Frank's house all evening, which struck her as odd since the automatic timers usually kicked in around sunset. Concerned, she had decided to check that everything was all right. The living room light suddenly flicked on, momentarily blinding Hawk after hours in darkness. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, her hand still on the light switch, her eyes widening at the scene before her. A stranger sitting on the floor with a backpack full of Frank's belongings, and Shadow standing guard like a statue. She let out a startled gasp. Who are you? What are you doing in Frank's house? Before Hawk could formulate a response, Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted to the hallway where she spotted Bear and Rex. Understanding dawned on her face. You broke in, she stated, her initial shock giving way to indignation. And the dogs caught you. Bear raised his hands in a placating gesture. Ma'am, this is all a misunderstanding. Mrs. Henderson wasn't listening. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket. I'm calling the police. Wait. Hawk called out but didn't dare stand up with Shadow still watching his every move. You don't understand. We were just stealing Frank's things. Mrs. Henderson finished for him, already dialing. I may be old, but I'm not stupid, young man. As she spoke with the emergency dispatcher explaining the situation, the dogs maintained their positions. They had been trained to hold threats until properly relieved. And despite Mrs. Henderson's arrival, they showed no signs of abandoning their posts. The police will be here in about 10 minutes, Mrs. Henderson announced after ending the call. She looked at the dogs with newfound appreciation. Frank always said you two were special. Now I see what he meant. She moved to sit in an armchair, keeping a safe distance from both the intruders and the dogs. Despite her apparent calm, her hands trembled slightly. Those medals you took, she said. Noticing the open display case and the items poking out of Bear's backpack, Frank earned them saving lives in Afghanistan. The Bronze Star was for pulling 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire. Her words landed heavily on the thieves. Stealing had always been just business to them, impersonal, practical. But suddenly the items in their bags had stories, had meaning beyond their monetary value. And those dogs, Mrs. Henderson continued, they served with him. Shadow once found an explosive device that could have killed Frank's entire unit. Rex took a bullet meant for Frank during an ambush. Bear looked at the German shepherd with new eyes. Now he noticed the slight irregularity in Rex's gait, the barely perceptible favor of his right hind leg, the physical reminder of his sacrifice. When Frank retired, he couldn't bear to leave them behind. He fought through mountains of paperwork to adopt them, said they deserved a peaceful retirement as much as he did. The minutes ticked by uncomfortably as they waited for the police. Outside, the distant wail of sirens gradually grew louder. Shadow and Rex remained focused and alert, their training holding firm even hours after the initial intrusion. "Why didn't they attack us?" Hawk finally asked, genuinely curious. "They could have torn us apart the moment we walked in." Mrs. Henderson considered the question. Frank mentioned once that they're trained to use appropriate force. In a war zone, that might mean taking down an armed enemy. In a home invasion, she shrugged. "I guess they decided you weren't worth biting." There was an odd sort of humiliation in that assessment that stung worse than their impending arrest. As the police cruisers pulled up outside, lights flashing against the darkened windows of neighboring homes, Mrs. Henderson stood up. "I should let the officers know about the dogs. They're perfectly safe if you don't move, but I wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong idea and doing something regrettable." She walked to the front door and stepped outside to meet the police, leaving Hawk and Bear alone with their canine captors once more. "We really messed up this time," Bear said quietly. Hawk nodded, the full weight of their situation finally sinking in. "At least we picked a house with dogs that were trained to restrain rather than maul. Small mercies, I guess." The front door opened again and 2 police officers entered cautiously, hands near their holstered weapons. They paused, taking in the bizarre scene. 2 men sitting compliantly on the floor, 2 large dogs standing guard, and an array of stolen items spilling from open backpacks. "Well," said the first officer, raising his eyebrows. "This is a first." Mrs. Henderson stepped in behind them. "The dogs are military trained. They belong to my neighbor, a veteran. They've been holding these burglars all evening." The second officer approached slowly, giving the dogs a respectful berth. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up very slowly and place your hands behind your back." As Hawk carefully rose to his feet under Shadow's watchful gaze, he couldn't help but think that in all his years of breaking into homes, he had never encountered security quite like this, and he hoped he never would again. The police officers worked efficiently, handcuffing Hawk and Bear while maintaining a respectful distance from Shadow and Rex. The dogs remained vigilant, their eyes tracking every movement in the room. "Amazing discipline," commented the first officer, a stocky man with graying hair at his temples. "Never seen anything like it." "Military working dogs," his partner replied, a younger officer who seemed both impressed and slightly unnerved by the Canines' unwavering focus. "My cousin served with a canine unit. Said those dogs are smarter than half the people he worked with." Once the thieves were secured, the older officer looked uncertainly at the dogs. "Ma'am," he addressed Mrs. Henderson, "do you know how to—" "Dismiss them or whatever the command would be. We need to search the suspects and the premises." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "I'm afraid I don't know their commands. Frank never shared those with me. He's very particular about who can give them orders." The younger officer pulled out his phone. "Let's call the owner then." "What's his number?" "He's fishing at Lake Mitchell," Mrs. Henderson explained. "Cell reception is spotty up there, but we can try." While the younger officer stepped outside to attempt the call, the older one carefully documented the scene, photographing the open display case, the backpacks with stolen items, and the points of entry. He maintained a wide berth around the dogs who had yet to relax their guard stance. "Been on the force 23 years, he remarked to Mrs. Henderson. "Never had perpetrators caught and held like this. Usually we're chasing them halfway across the county." Mrs. Henderson nodded proudly as if she personally had trained the dogs. "Frank always said they were the best at what they do. I guess this proves it," the younger officer returned, shaking his head. "Couldn't reach him. Went straight to voicemail. So what do we do about—" The older officer gestured toward Shadow and Rex. "I have a spare key to feed the fish when Frank's away," Mrs. Henderson offered. "But I don't know if the dogs will stand down just because we're removing the intruders." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this particular situation. Their training covered aggressive dogs, not highly disciplined military canines that were simply doing their job too well. "The county has an animal control officer on call," the younger officer suggested. "Maybe they'd have some ideas." "These aren't strays that need capturing," Mrs. Henderson protested. "They're trained service animals. I think we should try Frank again. Or maybe wait until morning when he might check his messages." In the patrol car outside, Hawk and Bear sat in uncomfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Through the window they could see the officers and Mrs. Henderson engaged in animated discussion, occasionally glancing toward the house. "What do you think they'll do with the dogs?" Bear finally asked. Hawk shrugged as best he could with his hands cuffed behind him. "Not our problem anymore." But despite his dismissive words, Hawk found himself oddly concerned about the animals' welfare. There was something about their intelligence, their dedication, that had earned his reluctant respect. They hadn't been needlessly aggressive or vicious. They had simply done their job with impressive efficiency. Inside the house, the situation had reached an impasse. The officers needed to process the crime scene properly, but were hesitant to work around the hyper-vigilant dogs. Mrs. Henderson was adamantly opposed to calling animal control, fearing the dogs might be tranquilized or otherwise mishandled. "Wait," said the older officer suddenly. "You mentioned fish. The owner has you feed his fish when he's away?" Mrs. Henderson nodded. "Yes, a beautiful tropical aquarium in his study. The fish need precise feeding schedules. But he left the dogs to fend for themselves?" The officer seemed skeptical. "Oh no," Mrs. Henderson clarified. "The dogs have an automatic feeder in the laundry room. And the special door to the backyard." She pointed toward the kitchen. "Frank set everything up so they could maintain their routines while he's gone." The younger officer snapped his fingers. "That's it. If they have routines, maybe they have a scheduled time when they're off duty or something." It wasn't the most scientific approach, but with limited options, they decided to wait and observe. The officers called in their situation, explaining that they had the suspects in custody but needed additional time at the scene due to unusual circumstances. Around 2 a.m., after nearly an hour of this uncomfortable waiting game, something changed. Rex, who had maintained his position in the hallway, suddenly turned and walked with purpose toward the laundry room. Shadow remained at his post for a moment longer, then also headed in the same direction. "They're moving," the younger officer whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. The three humans cautiously followed the dogs to the laundry room, where they found both animals standing expectantly by a large automatic feeder. As they watched, the machine whirred to life, dispensing measured portions of kibble into 2 metal bowls. "It's their feeding time," Mrs. Henderson realized. Frank must have programmed it for their normal schedule. The dogs began eating, still alert but clearly shifted into a different mode of operation. The older officer saw an opportunity. "Let's quickly finish processing what we need while they're distracted," he suggested. "We can take the evidence and file the full report. The crime scene photos should be sufficient for now." They worked efficiently, collecting the stolen items and completing the necessary documentation. By the time Shadow and Rex finished their meal, the officers had gathered what they needed. "I'll stay here for the night," Mrs. Henderson offered. "Keep an eye on things until we can reach Frank." The officers seemed relieved at this solution. "We'll have a patrol car drive by regularly through the night," the older one promised, "and we'll keep trying to contact the owner." With the immediate situation resolved, the officers left with their evidence and suspects. Mrs. Henderson settled into Frank's recliner, watching as the dogs resumed their patrol of the house, now acknowledging her presence with occasional glances, but primarily focused on their duties. "Good boys," she murmured, impressed by their dedication. Meanwhile, at the police station, Hawk and Bear were processed and placed in holding cells. The booking officer raised his eyebrows when he read the report. "Says here you were apprehended and held by dogs until police arrived," he remarked to Hawk. "That's a new one." Hawk said nothing, his mind still processing the night's events. Everything had gone wrong in a way he never could have anticipated. Years of carefully planning heists, of priding himself on thorough reconnaissance, and he'd been outsmarted by 2 dogs. In the adjacent cell, Bear seemed equally lost in thought. "You know," he finally said, "I keep thinking about what that old lady said. About the dogs taking bullets and finding bombs." Hawk nodded slowly. "Yeah, makes you think, doesn't it? About what some people and animals go through while we're back here just taking their stuff." It was a surprisingly reflective comment from Bear, who typically avoided thinking too deeply about their victims. Hawk had always approached theft as a straightforward transaction, identifying valuable items, acquiring them, selling them for profit. The people they stole from were abstractions, not real individuals with histories and sacrifices. But Frank Wilson was no longer an abstraction. Neither were Shadow and Rex. They had faces now and stories that Hawk couldn't simply file away and forget. At Lake Mitchell, Frank was having a frustrating night of fishing. The bass weren't biting and a light rain had started to fall, forcing him to take shelter under a small canopy on his boat. As he checked his phone for weather updates, he noticed several missed calls from an unknown number, and one from Mrs. Henderson. Reception was indeed spotty at the lake, but he drifted closer to shore where he had one bar of signal. Concerned, he immediately called Mrs. Henderson back. "Frank, thank goodness," she answered on the first ring despite the late hour. "You need to come home. There's been an incident. Are you okay?" Frank asked immediately, already pulling up his anchor. "I'm fine, and so are Shadow and Rex. In fact, they're the heroes of the hour." She quickly explained the situation, the break-in, the dog's response, and the current standoff with the evidence collection. Frank couldn't help the proud smile that spread across his face. They did exactly what they're trained to do: contain the threat without excessive force. "The police need some guidance on how to work around them," Mrs. Henderson explained. "They're still in full protection mode. I'll head back right away," Frank promised. "Should be there by morning. In the meantime, there's a command phrase that will let them know it's okay to stand down temporarily." He gave Mrs. Henderson the specific words and pronunciation, explaining that the dogs were trained to recognize certain phrases as temporary relief orders when they couldn't receive direct commands from their handler. After ending the call, Frank quickly packed up his fishing gear. The trip was a small sacrifice compared to knowing his home and possessions had been protected by his faithful companions. As he started the drive back to Pine Creek, he found himself reflecting on the unique bond he shared with Shadow and Rex. They weren't just pets. They were partners who had shared the darkest and most dangerous moments of his military career. They had saved his life more than once, and now they had protected his home with the same dedication they had shown on the battlefield. Some might question why he had brought war-trained dogs into a peaceful suburban neighborhood, but tonight had proven what Frank had always known: that Shadow and Rex's discipline and intelligence made them not more dangerous, but more reliable than ordinary guard dogs. As his truck ate up the miles toward home, Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude. The fishing trip could wait for another weekend. Right now his team needed him, and he was on his way back to them. The first light of dawn was breaking over Pine Creek when Frank's red pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Despite driving through the night, he looked alert, the situation having triggered the same focused readiness he had relied on during his military service. As he stepped out of the truck, he could see Mrs. Henderson's car still parked at the curb. The front door opened before he reached it, and Mrs. Henderson greeted him with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you're back," she said. "Your boys have been on duty all night." Frank nodded gratefully. "I can't thank you enough for staying, Helen." "Those dogs of yours are something else," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. The command phrase worked. They relaxed enough to let the police finish their work, but they've been patrolling non-stop since then. As if on cue, Shadow appeared at the end of the hallway, his posture immediately changing at the sight of his handler. The Belgian Malinois trotted over, pressing against Frank's leg in a rare display of affection. Moments later, Rex emerged from the kitchen, his tail wagging slightly, the only break in his otherwise professional demeanor. "At ease, boys," Frank said softly, kneeling to greet them properly. He checked them over with practiced hands, confirming neither had been injured during the confrontation. "Good job, very good job." Mrs. Henderson watched the reunion with a smile. "The police said they've never seen anything like it. Those men were completely trapped, couldn't move an inch without the dogs reacting. But they never got bitten, never even got growled at unless they tried to move. Frank nodded, pride evident in his expression. That's exactly how they're trained. Minimum force necessary to control the situation. He stood up, surveying the living room. Any damage to the house? Just the locks on the back door where they picked them, Mrs. Henderson explained. The police took photos of everything. They said they'd need your statement when you got back. Frank checked his watch. I'll head down to the station this morning. But first, I think these two deserve a break and a proper meal. He gestured to the dogs, who remained attentively at his side. After Mrs. Henderson left to get some much-needed rest, Frank prepared a special breakfast for Shadow and Rex. Their usual kibble mixed with some lean ground beef he'd brought back from his cut-short fishing trip. As the dogs ate, he examined the back door, making mental notes about upgrading the security. Later that morning, freshly showered and changed, Frank drove to the Pine Creek police station. The front desk officer recognized him immediately. Mr. Wilson, we've been expecting you. Officer Tanner is handling your case. Officer Tanner turned out to be the older officer from the night before. He greeted Frank with a firm handshake and undisguised curiosity. Those are some dogs you've got, Mr. Wilson. 23 years on the force, and I've never seen anything quite like that. Frank smiled slightly. They're special, that's for sure. Former military working dogs. We served 3 tours together in Afghanistan. That explains a lot, Tanner said, leading Frank to his desk. The way they controlled the situation was, well, impressive doesn't quite cover it. As they sat down, Tanner opened a file containing the incident report and photographs. We've got the suspects in custody, 2 men, both with prior records for burglary. They're being charged with breaking and entering, attempted theft, and property damage. How did they seem when you arrested them? Frank asked, genuinely curious. Tanner chuckled. Shaken. Very shaken. I think your dogs gave them a lot to think about during their little standoff. He shuffled some papers. We recovered all your stolen property. It'll be returned once it's processed as evidence. After giving his statement and signing the necessary forms, Frank hesitated. The men who broke in, I'd like to speak with them if that's possible. Tanner raised his eyebrows in surprise. That's an unusual request. May I ask why? Frank wasn't entirely sure himself. Just curious, I guess, about what kind of people would target my home and what they thought when they met Shadow and Rex. After some consideration and a few phone calls, Tanner arranged for Frank to speak with the burglars in an interview room, under supervision. Frank waited patiently, still not entirely sure what he wanted to say to them. When the door opened, Hawk and Bear were led in, handcuffed and wearing orange jumpsuits. They looked tired and subdued, a far cry from the confident criminals who had picked Frank's locks the night before. This is Mr. Wilson, Officer Tanner explained. The owner of the house you broke into. He wanted to speak with you. The thieves looked at Frank with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. For a moment, nobody spoke. I just wanted to meet you, Frank finally said. And to ask why you chose my house. Hawk shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It looked like an easy target. Modest house, owner away for the weekend. He paused. We didn't know about the dogs. No one ever does, Frank replied evenly. That's partly the point. Bear looked up. Those aren't just any dogs, are they? The old lady, your neighbor, she told us they served in the war with you. Frank nodded. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Shadow is specialized in explosives detection and perimeter security. Rex is trained in patrol and apprehension. They've saved my life and the lives of my unit members more times than I can count. The burglars absorbed this information silently. Frank noticed how they avoided his gaze, looking instead at the table, the walls, anywhere but directly at him. You know what the hardest part was? Frank continued, his voice level. Coming home. Adjusting to civilian life after years in combat zones. For me, and for them. He gestured toward the invisible presence of his dogs. They don't understand fireworks on the 4th of July. They get anxious in crowded places. They need routine and purpose. Hawk looked up, momentarily meeting Frank's eyes. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I want you to understand what you walked into last night," Frank replied. "Not just a house with some valuable stuff. A home where two war veterans are trying to live a peaceful life after seeing things and doing things that would give most people nightmares." The room fell silent again. Officer Tanner watched from the corner, clearly intrigued by the unusual conversation. "They could have torn us apart," Bear said quietly. "But they didn't. They just held us there." Frank nodded. "Minimum necessary force. That's how they're trained. In Afghanistan, that might have meant taking down an armed insurgent. In my living room, it meant containing 2 unarmed intruders until help arrived." The implications of this comparison hung in the air. Both Hawk and Bear seemed to be seeing their actions in a new light, not just as a botched burglary, but as an invasion of a sanctuary, hard-won by sacrifice. "I'm not here to lecture you or forgive you," Frank continued. "That's for the courts to handle. I just wanted you to know who you stole from and who caught you." As he stood to leave, Bear spoke up again. "Those medals we took, the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, you earned those over there?" Frank paused at the door. "We earned them, me and the dogs. We're a team, always have been." With that, he left the room, feeling strangely lighter. He hadn't planned what to say, but somehow the right words had come. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, just truth. In the following weeks, word of the incident spread throughout Pine Creek. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Frank before now stopped to chat when he walked Shadow and Rex in the evenings. Mrs. Henderson had apparently shared the story with everyone who would listen, transforming the dogs from mysterious presences to local heroes. Frank found himself fielding questions about military working dogs, their training, and their transition to civilian life. At the urging of several veterans in the community, he even agreed to give a talk at the local library about the bond between handlers and their canine partners. "People don't understand what these animals do for our troops," he explained to a packed room. "They run toward danger when every instinct tells them to run away. They do it because they trust their handlers and because they've been trained to protect." In the audience, a young boy raised his hand. "Are they still dangerous now that they're not in the army anymore?" Frank smiled. "They're still capable of everything they were trained to do, but they're disciplined. They assess threats and respond appropriately. That's what makes them special." Another community member asked, "What happened to those burglars? Are they in jail?" "They're awaiting trial," Frank replied. "But I heard something interesting from Officer Tanner yesterday. Apparently they've been asking about programs for military dog adoption and support. Seems they might have had a change of heart about some things. Whether this change would last? Beyond their legal troubles remained to be seen, but Frank found himself hoping it might. Not everyone got to experience firsthand the intelligence and loyalty of dogs like Shadow and Rex. Perhaps that night, despite its criminal beginnings, had created an unexpected ripple of understanding. As spring turned to summer in Pine Creek, life settled back into its familiar rhythms. Frank continued his quiet existence with Shadow and Rex, fishing on weekends when the weather was good, and working part-time at a local hardware store. But something had shifted in his relationship with the community. He was no longer just the reserved veteran at the end of Oakwood Drive. He and his dogs had become part of the neighborhood's shared story, a reminder that heroes come in many forms and sometimes have 4 legs and fur. And on warm evenings when Frank sat on his front porch with Shadow and Rex at his feet, he would wave to Mrs. Henderson and the other neighbors walking by. His house was no longer just a building to defend, but truly a home within a community. For a man who had spent years in war zones, this simple peace felt like the greatest victory of all.